print your patterns. So I printed off two patterns. I printed off the Caitlin from freesewing.org. For their instructions, they gave a link to Foundations Revealed, which I told you about a couple of weeks ago. So there wasn't really many instructions per se. It was a link to an external site. Now the Ariana Black corset that I also printed, I printed the Erin. It also does not have instructions. Relax, we're gonna be fine. But it did come with instructions on how to print your corset properly, and how to do your sizing, and there was a fair bit of information that came with the corset. It's just not the step-by-step construction instructions. Construction instructions. Say that 10 times fast. Construction instruction, construction instructions. If you have never printed out a sewing pattern before, something to keep in mind is that you need to not have your pages scaled. Often that's something that printers will automatically do. They will scale for margins on the sides of the pages. So you need to make sure that your page is listed as actual size or 100%, okay? And that's gonna make sure that it prints out the right size. You need that. The Ariana Black corset came with no seam allowances marked, which is really common for corset patterns. The one on freesewing.org, it did have, I think it was a 1 centimeter, I think that's what it said. Yeah, I think so. Regardless, because it is the place that it is and I can go in and do a whole bunch of tweaks, I actually tweaked that pattern to have no seam allowances as well, just so that I'm starting off with two patterns that are going to operate the same, so that it's not confusing when I'm like going back and forth between them, because I'm going to sew both corsets at the same time. Okay, next we need to tape everything together. Now, my usual habit with patterns is to tape all of my rows together and then tape my row to row to row. That's just how I do it. What I started to notice really quickly with the Ariana Black corset is that her corset pieces print out so that they're usually only on 2 pages. So you don't have to like tape the whole big thing together. You can match up the pieces and just tape those together, which just ended up, I mean, it's a little bit less cumbersome because it's like your rough cut is already done, which was beneficial. The freesewing.org corset came I did have to do all in one piece. I actually wouldn't say one is better than the other. It's just something I noticed that was a little different about the Ariana Black ones. So if your corset pattern is a paper pattern that you got from a store, or it prints out and it has to be all in one big sheet, at this point, go ahead and just rough cut out your pieces, just so that you have like one corset piece on a chunk of paper, and you don't have them all stuck together. Because the first thing we're going to adjust is the height of the garment. Remember last week when we measured the height between the underbust and the waist and the waist and the high hip? This is where this is going to come in to be very important. The reason that it's so important to take those measurements in those different sections is because people have length in their torso in different places, as they do in their whole body. You know, you can have two people that are the same height, and one person, you know, most of their height is in their legs, another person, most of their height is in their torso, and one person might be like evenly matched. So it's important to know where your height is. For me, I have a really high placed waist, so what I actually have to do is I have to decrease my waist to underbust, and then I have to greatly increase my underbust and my waist to high hip length. I'll show you how that worked. If you do have to adjust the height at all, I strongly recommend making yourself a template of the eyelet holes, because those are going to change position when you adjust the height on your corset, and it'll just be easier for you to go back later and mark those out if you've already sort of made yourself a template. I did not think of that, so I just went back and I reprinted the couple of pieces that I needed for that eyelet template for the Ariana Black corset, and the freesewing.org corset did not have their eyelets marked, so I'm just going to use the same template for that one. You're going to notice most of my work today is going to be on the Ariana Black corset because the freesewing.org corset was made to my measurement, so I am not touching it, I'm not measuring it, I'm not doing anything to it because I want to just see how well it fits. It's new for me. Okay, so to adjust for the length, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut all of my lengthen and shorten lines because I know from my measurements I need to make adjustments throughout the whole garment. But if you measure yourself and measure your garment, you might find that you only need to, some people just need to have a length added between their hip and their waist. And if that's all you need to do, then that's all you need to do. I need to do all three. All right, so I am going to first attach one side of my pattern to my scrap paper. If you have had to cut your pattern piece out from a larger pattern and you don't have straight edges, then you can use your ruler along your grain line to make sure that you're lining things up properly. Now I'm just going to measure the distance between my hip line and my waistline, and I'm going to move my pattern pieces until I get to the right distance between the two. Now for the middle section, I actually need to move my waistline up, so I'm going to reduce this. And this is the gap between my waist and my underbust that I need to reduce. Sometimes you might find there's enough length in a garment for you. The length just isn't where you need it to be. And so this is how you adjust for that. And then again, between my underbust and my bust line, I need to add more. Now that I've made these adjustments, I have to repeat them on all my pattern pieces. So I'm just gonna measure these purple sections as well as the overlap section where I shortened it. And that measurement it'll make it easier to replicate this on all the other pieces. So I've added 2 1/4 inches into the bust, I've reduced the waist by 1 1/4 inches, and then I've added 3 1/4 inches to my waist to hip. Now, because these, well, okay, that does have a straight edge. It's like the worst example I could have grabbed. Okay, so here we go. Look at this piece. There is nothing straight about it, which means it would be very, very easy to, when I added length, to like accidentally shift these pieces out of their alignment. So you'll see here that I have drawn a line that comes up from the grain line on the pattern, and every pattern piece should have the grain line marked. You might have to go in and make the grain line longer before you cut your pattern pieces apart, but that line is where you're gonna make sure that your pattern piece stays in alignment. There's nowhere, like I can't stick this next to a straight edge and hope that I've lined it up properly, right? That's not gonna work. So give yourself a marking through the middle of your pattern. If there's no grain line there, then create one so that when you put your pieces back together and you tape them with your spacers in, if that's something you have to do, that you are lining them up correctly. Same thing goes if you're decreasing space too, right? It would be really easy to accidentally like slide it over one way or the other. Give yourself that line. You can see on this piece here, this is where the gore gets put in, and the lines for lengthen and shorten are on an angle. So this is where it really becomes important to make sure that you have some kind of center line that you can line everything up with. And while we're on the topic of that gore, if you are going to add length into the main pattern piece where the gore goes, you also need to add length into your gore itself. Now that we have the height all adjusted in our pieces, now we need to cut out our size. If you are just one size and one size is what fits you, great, cut that size out. I myself have to grade between several sizes. My underbust, my waist, and my high hip are all very different sizes, so I'm going to grade in between those. I often use, this is a hip curve ruler, so you would use it if you were drafting like a skirt or pants. That's the purpose of this guy here. Sometimes I will just use a straight edge, and sometimes I'll just eyeball it, honestly, because it's really about having a smooth transition between those lines more than anything else. You don't want to have like weird kind of corners poking out or weird like tight spots. So it's really just about blending those lines nicely. So when I go to cut my size, first I'm just gonna give myself a little dot on the line that I'm starting at for each size. So I've marked my size for the top of the corset, that is my bust area. Then I'm going to my under bust and I'm marking the size that I am with that measurement. Then I will do the same at the waist and again at the high hip. So I'm going to use a straight edge in the straighter part of my pattern to go from one size to the next. And then I'm going to use my hip curve. And I've got a couple of other curved rulers kicking around. You just sort of want the nicest sort of sloping line that you can get that will connect one size to the next. So you can see right here, there's sort of like an overlap of where I needed to sort of elongate that curved line just so that it nicely worked itself into the straight line. You really want to just make sure that you don't have any weird corners jutting out everywhere. When you are blending between sizes and when you are blending over spaces where you've added or decreased length, you're gonna find there's these like little corners that wind up getting shaved off in places. It's okay, but it's okay. It's okay if those little corners get shaved off. Now here's what I was talking about where there's gonna be like, it's gonna add a little bit of width in sort of one area of my hip, but take it away in another area because of just getting those lines to smoothly come together. That one I think is going to be a little bit too wide. It's adding too much width. So I've gone to a flatter part of my ruler. And I'm just going to do that same connection again with the flatter part. See, I think that one's going to be better. So that inside line is the one I'm going to go with. And then I will do the same on the other side. Now I have my sizes marked. I can actually go and cut my pieces out. Okay, so last week I had you take some measurements that were maybe not asked for by your pattern, and I'm going to show you what to do now. Now this is like kind of nitpicky stuff. Like if you don't do this, you'll catch whatever mistakes there are in your mock-up anyway. This is kind of like extra credit pattern fitting, okay? So if you find it confusing, it's not like you can't do your corset without doing this, you totally can. You'll catch it in your mock-up. I just try and get my pattern to fit me as close as I can before I do that mock-up. So these are my measurements. I have my full bust here, my front bust measurement. All I did was I subtracted my front from my full bust and I got my back measurement. Did the same thing with my under bust. Now you'll see that I have, all of these are divided by 2. That's because we are only dealing with a half pattern here. All right, I don't have the full width of my garment represented here, I just have half. So that's why all of these had to be divided by 2. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my pattern pieces and right here, this is the bust line. And I wanna check that against my bust measurement. If this were like a regular shirt or something, I would be looking for that my shirt would fit my measurements plus my wearing ease, whereas this is a negative ease garment. So what I'm looking for is that my garment is smaller than my measurements, but that my negative ease is sort of distributed where I need it to be. So I'm gonna use my grid mat here and I'm going to butt all of these pieces up because remember there's no seam allowance on this pattern. If you are using a pattern that does have seam allowance, like it's one of the big 4 patterns or something, mark out your seam allowance and then overlap it by however much your seam allowance is, okay? Now I don't care if these pieces were in shapes that overlap somewhere else above or below this line. I don't really care. I just need this line to have each of the pieces butt up against each other so that I can see how long this whole line is going to be. So this is 12 and about 3/4 inches. Ideally there should be a little bit more reduction here. However, I've lost weight, so we're just going to keep on taking these measurements. And now I'm going to do my front under bust. See, and like I said, these pieces are overlapping, totally fine. This line is not. All right, so that is 10. Now I'm going to do the same on the back pieces. But there's something else you need to consider there, and that is your lacing gap. So this pattern says that it has a 2-inch lacing gap at the back. So I need to account for 1 inch since I'm only dealing with half of the back here. Again, I'm gonna line up my bust line on my grid. If you don't have one of these grid mats, this is just how I do it. You can absolutely just line them up and stick a measuring tape next to it, use a ruler, whatever. And if you're really concerned about, you know, like if you have a bit more tummy, then you could absolutely do this around your waistline with your waist measurements as well. These are the spots where I know I have problems fitting. All right, so these measurements are really close. This is not enough negative ease for a corset. Okay, my measurements are way too close together. But I didn't want to, you know, log into my computer and get my old measurements, so I just retook my measurements today. So I know that part of the problem is that I've lost weight. So I'm gonna have to just recut and make my corset smaller. However, that's a problem that I'm having with my numbers. What I want you to look for is I want you to look for the back being too big and the front being too small. It's a negative ease garment, so it's a little hard to tell because everything should be a little bit too small. But if all of your negative ease is in the front and you don't have any in the back, then it's quite possible that your chest is larger than what the pattern anticipated. So if you do have a larger chest, you might need to move some of the fabric from the back into the front. The fabric just might not be where you need it to be. So how do you do that? Well, first off, you can cut a smaller size in the back. And then if you're finding that, you know, maybe it's just in the bust that you have like way more negative ease or less ease, I guess, then you would cut a larger size just in the bust. And then you would grade that back to whatever size you are at the underbust or at the waist. So using the same technique that I showed you earlier about like grading between sizes, you can play with that. So if you do have a larger bust, I do recommend checking your pattern this way, just because it could save you like having to do an extra mock-up by making sure the fabric is where you need it to be. And there we go. We have done a ton of adjustments. Well, I've done a ton of adjustments. I don't know if you needed to. Maybe you didn't need to, and that's okay too. I mean, obviously these patterns are made for a specific body type. If you are a very close size to the fit model or to Ariana Black herself, I'm assuming she is her fit model. So, you know, if you're a very close body type to her, you might not have had to do hardly anything to these patterns, and that's okay. Next week, we're gonna start taking the patterns and putting them onto some fabric. We're gonna remember to put some seam allowance in there, and we're gonna start mocking up. It's gonna be fun.